us. And actually, we were in discussion with Sam and Sarah, and Sam made the comment that you never hear a sermon on gossip. So, well, I have a sermon on gossip, so we will do a sermon on gossip this morning. So I thought, well, there's certain conversations, if you will, in every church, I think, that are avoided, and this is certainly one that I think a lot of times causes a problem. And actually, I want to illustrate this particular subject by asking a couple of questions. Start off with that. Would it be wrong to hear about someone else's sin secondhand and then repeat it to members of the church? Would that be wrong? The reason I ask it, because if that is gossip, then the Apostle Paul would be guilty of it for what he wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 about another man having his father's wife. In fact, apparently, from what we gather in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul learned about this particular incident from Chloe's household. In fact, Paul wrote the church about this individual without ever even talking to the individual. So that flies in the face with a lot of things that are often said concerning the idea of gossip, that we shouldn't be talking and we shouldn't say anything about somebody without talking to them first, and such principles as that as we often convey. But is that true if we don't? In other words, is it sin? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe Paul committed any sin. Let me ask you another question that helps us to illustrate just how difficult this subject is. Would it be gossip for a church to tell the entire congregation of a member's sin when the church withdraws their fellowship? After all, it's none of their business, right? And a lot of times, churches go to great pains not to say what it is the person came forward for, or to let them know why the person was withdrawn from. Yet, the scriptures in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 20 says, "Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear." In order for the congregation to fear, they got to know what it is the individual is being rebuked for. So, is it wrong then to, because actually the idea is that, well, the church would be gossiping or encouraging gossip, because if the church knew what the person was being withdrawn from, then they're going to gossip about that. And the opposite's also true. If they don't tell them, they're also going to gossip there too. So, right? So however you look at it, it's kind of a quandary. You see, I illustrate the topic with those questions because gossip is a leading cause of problems within the Lord's church. And I think a bigger problem is members accusing other members of gossip where no gossip exists. The real problem is ignorance concerning gossip, concerning the whole concept of gossip, the word gossip. So in this lesson, what we're going to try to do is clearly define what gossip is, and I hope I don't lose you. I hope that you will stay with me and understand there is a distinction that really needs to be made, especially when we're talking about gossip that's sinful versus gossip that is not. The word gossip in our language is a broad term that encompasses many forms of harmful communication. For example, we might use the word gossip when we really mean slander. And that's very appropriate, and in fact very common in our usage of the word gossip in the English language. We might use the word gossip to describe someone talking disparagingly about another person. And in English, that would be correct. It would be a correct usage of the word gossip. But in Greek, there is no such broad term as the word gossip. In Greek, specific words are used to describe the type of harmful communication being addressed. In English, we throw them all into the same umbrella, into the same group, and we call it gossip. It's kind of like the English word love. In Greek, there are more specific words that you can use that define the word love. But in English, we just say love. We don't look at phileo or agape. Those are more specific terms. They both mean love, and in English, we translate them love. And so it's not inappropriate. It's not wrong. Don't misunderstand me. The usage of the word gossip is still correct. where we're having a problem, I think, with the word gossip is using it to mean something simple sometimes when it's really not, as illustrated by Paul, or as illustrated by our question concerning the church withdrawing. In Greek, they have those separate words. They used words tale-bearing, whispering, backbiting, slander, or evil speaking, that we simply categorize as gossip in our English language. So that in and of itself makes the situation, or at least this particular subject, a little bit hard to deal with, a little bit muddied, if you will. So what I want to do, first of all, is define all these words. And I hope that as we go through in defining these words, that you'll kind of pay attention to how these words are being defined. In other words, I want you to see, as we go along, does that definition imply sin or not, in particular? We'll start with the word gossip. And incidentally, the word gossip itself is not found in the King James Version Bible. It's not there. In the New King James Version, it is found one time. It's actually translated gossips and gossip instead of talebearer, or tattlers, I think is the word, to Timothy. But the point being, as we've already talked about in Greek, there isn't a word for gossip per se. Now, Webster defines gossip as a person who habitually reveals personal or sensational facts. That's Webster's definition, first and foremost. The secondary definition is rumor or report of an intimate nature. Now, given that definition, Paul was a gossip, because Paul was revealing sensational facts of an intimate nature. In fact, we could even argue that Paul habitually did that, because remember Peter in Galatians chapter 2, he did the same thing. Peter was in sin, and Paul called him out, and even wrote about it. And you think, well, that would be wrong. That would be gossip, right? Well, according to this definition, yeah, it kind of appears like Paul was a gossip. I found a definition. I was listening to radio, and Dr. Laura was on, and she defined gossip this way. She said that gossip is the spreading of information about a person with the intention of hurting that person's reputation. I thought, that's a pretty good definition of gossip. But again, by Dr. Laura's definition, Paul would be a gossip, because Paul was spreading information about a person that did hurt his reputation. Whether his intentions were, we would say not, but people could argue what his intentions are, because we don't really know. Obviously, he wanted his reputation to be hurt in some way in order to get him to repent. So by this definition, Dr. Laura would be calling Paul a gossip. Strong's has a definition I think is much better than the previous two. And it's interesting, I think, in Strong's, because Strong's does translations, right? And the word gossip isn't in the Greek, but Strong's defines the word anyway. Strong defines gossip as a traducer, a false accuser, devil, or slanderer. Now, Webster defines a traducer as one who, as to expose to shame or blame by means of falsehood or misrepresentation. Now, why I think this is a much better definition is because we cannot relate Paul as a gossip using this definition. And I believe, therefore, this definition is probably far more accurate for what it is that we should be using as a term gossip. Not that it's wrong to say gossip is somebody who spreads information or those previous definitions, because that is how we use it in the English language. But in scriptures, when we're talking about whether it's wrong or right, this definition seems to me to at least appeal to me better than anything else, because it defines the gossip in the sense of sin. It helps us to understand, when does gossip become sin? And that's maybe the question I should ask. When does gossip become sin? Because you can gossip, as we're going to find out with some of these other references, without necessarily committing a sin. Again, Strong says it's to expose to shame or blame by means of falsehood or misrepresentation. He also called it a false accuser, a devil, or a slanderer. So what's the word slander mean? Well, I went to Vines, and I liked his definition only because he included the word gossip. And maybe before we move on, let me just say gossip is the use of misrepresentations, lies, in order to shame or blame another. And I think if we hang on to that definition, then we will do much better understanding when gossip is wrong. Truth is a defense against the charge of gossip, in other words. If you're telling the truth, it's not gossip. If it's true, it's true. So if I impart to you something that is true, such as somebody being put in jail, am I gossiping? Or am I just telling the truth? I'm just telling you the truth. That's not gossip if I'm telling you the truth. So let's go to the definition of the word slander. Vines define slander as those who are given to finding fault with the demeanor or conduct of others and spreading their innuendos and criticisms in the church. Now, the reason I like this definition is because he threw it in the church as though that's the only place you can find gossip. I'm sure he's not meaning that, but that's kind of how it cut across. But, well, that's interesting. He reveals that we have a problem in any church. But again, I think this is really a better definition of the word gossip in English than it is the word slander in Greek. He defines again the word slander as those who are given to finding fault with the demeanor or conduct of others and spreading their innuendos and criticisms. So that really kind of defines to me more of a general use of the word slander, really conveying the idea of gossip, if you ask me. Webster says about slander, the utterance of false charges or misrepresentations which defame and damage another's reputation. Now notice how similar this is to Strong's definition of gossip. You see, it's almost interchangeable, as you might have already noticed. That the Webster's definition of slander is essentially the same definition of Strong's definition of the word gossip. We are basically talking about the same concept, and we know we are, but we like to kind of use it a little differently when we talk to one another. Also, Webster says it's a false and defamatory oral statement about a person. Now notice, in his definitions about slander, we're talking about definite lies, misrepresentations, and falsehoods. We're talking about sin in order to spread this gossip. Whisper. Again, this is the Greek word whisper. Webster's defined whisper simply as gossip or rumor. Again, gossip is a broad term. Rumor is a broad term. Not necessarily conveying that you did something wrong or said something wrong. You could spread a rumor between people and not convey any kind of sin involved. It's just you heard the rumor is some street's going to get repaired next week. That's a rumor. It's not necessarily wrong or right, but it's still considered a rumor. Whisper, second definition of Webster, is spreading confidential and especially derogatory reports. And so now he's kind of getting a little bit more deep into the idea of whispering. Vines calls it secret slander. Now when we use the word slander, now we're talking lies, misrepresentations, and falsehoods again. And this is how Vines defines whispering. You see how much of a variance we have in the definitions between different sources? They go from the whole idea of gossip in a much broader general usage of the concept to when they throw in the word slander, we're talking specific sin. We're talking about lies and falsehood, misrepresentations. We're talking about things that are definitely wrong. He calls it secret slander, and the idea of slandering another person in private, he says. And he says it's synonymous with backbiting. Well, if it's synonymous with backbiting and it involves secret slander, then backbiting also involves slander. In fact, if we go to Vine's definition on backbiting, it literally means to speak against. If you literally translated it, that's how you would translate it, to speak against. In the Greek, the Greek word, which is in your outline, has been translated as evil speaking, backbiting, speak evil, or speak against, depending on where you find it in the Bible. Again, Vines mentions it's synonymous with whispering. The only distinction between backbiting is slander is slander done in open or in a public manner, whereas whispering is done behind a person's back in secret. So that's really the only difference between whispering and backbiting is the means or the occasion by which you are doing the slandering. You're slandering either in their face or you're slandering them behind their back. The scriptures use all these terms to refer to one kind of communication that we call, in English, gossip. So I'm not saying that the word gossip is incorrectly applied. It's not. In English, it's correctly applied. But in Greek, they're being more specific than just saying gossip. Because we often look at that definition and then we broadly categorize it, because it is a broad word, and then we throw people in, or maybe I should say under the bus, as though they've done something wrong when they may not have done anything wrong whatsoever. All these terms seem to incorporate the term slander, which is the use of falsehood, misrepresentations, and lies. Paul was not gossiping because he was telling the truth. And I believe that's also true about a church announcing the sin of withdrawn. They're not gossiping because they're telling the truth. And they're not encouraging people to gossip because they're telling the truth. And if members of the church go and communicate the withdrawal to somebody else, they will be telling the truth as well. The problem comes is when we're not telling the truth. That's when gossip becomes wrong. Gossip is when we talk about another person as we've defined, but it also includes the ideas being related through through truthful communication, like Paul did. We would still, by our English definition of the word gossip, say Paul is a gossip or a gossiper, because you shouldn't be doing that, right? Does that mean Paul did something wrong? Well, no. Gossip is not a biblical term. It's not a biblical concept in the broad usage that we do in English. Gossip that condemns one's soul is the use of lies, falsehoods, and misrepresentations. Paul wasn't doing that. A church wouldn't do that when they go to withdraw from a member of the church. The problem is that when one side accuses the other side without knowing what the truth is. Now you probably bordering more on that gossip, because if it isn't true and you're talking about it as though it is, what happens if it isn't? Well, now you're in sin, because that would be a falsehood. That would be misrepresentation. I don't know how many times as a preacher I've been accused of lying because somebody disagreed. A lot of times members of the church will hear a sermon and they'll disagree with you and call the preacher a liar, only perhaps to find out later that, no, the preacher has his sources. It's actually a correct statement. But who's actually doing the gossiping then? Was it the preacher who was gossiping, if he's telling the truth? Or was it the member gossiping when he's accusing the preacher of lying when he wasn't? Remember what gossip is, or what slander is? It's the use of lies, misrepresentations, and falsehoods. We've got to be really careful with this, because we don't want to be ones who are spreading things that aren't true, thinking they are true, unless we know they're true. Now that's where Paul had the advantage. Being inspired an apostle of God, he had the advantage of knowing what was true through the Holy Spirit. So he had the confidence, if you will, of not having necessarily to investigate it, because he already knows the truth. And so therefore he could write about it. It's not gossip, even though he did things that we would call gossip, because it was true. And remember, keep that in mind as we kind of move along, because gossip has a lot of bad effects. And again, the bad effects are because we're talking about really lies, misrepresentations, and falsehoods. That's called slander in our language as well as in the Greek, and that's really what we're talking about, because when you go through and try to find a good definition of the word gossip, you go from anything that's benign in definition to something specific like slander. And that's all gossip in English. The point being, I guess, that we need to take away from this is the sin of gossip isn't necessarily a sin. Though a lot of times, that's how it's conveyed in our English. There are evil effects, bad effects from the use of gossip, and we ought to stay away, and I'm using this word broadly in the English. I'm going to throw it out there. I'm saying gossip when I'm really talking about the idea of slander, because I believe that's really what we're talking about in a negative sense when we're talking about gossip. Gossip will separate the best of friends. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 28. It tells us in scriptures, a perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer, that's the guy who does it behind your back, separates the best of friends. That's a person who slanders your friend behind his back. That will cause problems, right? If you're being misrepresented to somebody else and you find out later that this other person was telling this and it wasn't even true, yeah, you're going to have some problems and you're going to have some separation going on. Chapter 17, verse 9. A present is a precious stone. No, I don't think I got the right ones. Proverbs 17, verse 9. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. So repeating things that ought not to be repeated, that's actually more general with the word gossip. That too, whether it's right or wrong, sometimes will separate friends. Causing strife hurts the recipient. In Proverbs chapter 26, verses 20 through 22, it says, where there is no wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no talebearer, that's a gossiper in our English language, strife ceases. As charcoal is as to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer, or we would say gossiper, are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body. It seems to be the negative is what appeals to people more than the positive. And when you've got negative information, people love to share it. That's not to say negative information shared is wrong, but it could be. And you've got to consider how it might affect other people. And I kind of throw that out there because when you think about what Paul was doing, his intentions was to save a soul. But in order to do that, he had to spread, if you will, the information of this individual in sin. How else is he going to achieve what it is that is more important in this life? The King James Version says the words of a talebearer are as wounds. And so somebody who's going around especially telling lies and misrepresenting you, they are going to be wounds. And obviously that makes sense. Actually, Proverbs chapter 25, 23 tells us as well that it causes anger. 25, verse 23, the north wind brings forth rain, and the backbiting tongue, not being in front of you, the backbiting tongue and angry countenance. You got somebody who's accusing you falsely to your face, slandering you, telling you lies about you which aren't even true. That makes you mad. And that's a problem with the whole idea of gossip. And we throw it again all into the same bucket. Psalms 31. Psalms 31 verses 13. We'll just go there. Gossip causes fear and may even lead to bloodshed. Psalms 31 verse 13. It says, for I hear the slander of many. Slander being very specific to the type of gossip. Fear is on every side. While they take counsel together against me, they scheme to take away my life. David believed to have made such a statement. I could think of Naboth and his vineyard. What did Jezebel do in order to effect his death or demise? Well, it was slander to his face in court. He got some false witnesses to tell a lie about him. That's slander. Right before his face. And what did that result in? That resulted in Naboth being executed for blasphemy that he never committed. So yes, gossip in general, more specifically slander, will cause all these bad effects that we categorize as gossip. But again, what we need to understand is all these things that we talked about in the Greek anyway, especially if we're going to use the word gossip, it is forbidden. By gossiping, we are judging another as an evildoer as if we were to judge in such a manner. Going over to James chapter 4 and verse 11. James chapter 4 and verse 11. Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. So we got to be very careful. If we're going to say something bad about somebody, it better be true. But when we speak evil, we're talking about using tactics which aren't true, which aren't worldly. Say lies, speaking evil, incorporating lies into things that we say against somebody else. So that's the idea. Do not speak evil of anybody. Don't be lying about anybody. Don't be misrepresenting them. Don't be telling falsehoods or trying to mislead people into thinking that they've done something that they didn't. We've got to be careful about this, because the Lord says when we do that, if we mislead into people and we're lying about somebody else, and we're judging them as though we're a judge of the law when we aren't. Sometimes we think things are one way. We assume, there's a bad word, we assume the person did something wrong. And we heard the statement and we assumed that that was wrong, that was a lie. But was it? You see, assumption isn't fact. Folks, that's when we get into gossip. So the person making the accusation is the one who's doing the gossiping, not the person who presented the statement. You see how befuddling this becomes. Ephesians chapter 4, using the term speaking evil. Ephesians chapter 4, 31 and 32. Here, though speaking evil, the term speaking evil means injurious speaking, out of Ephesians 4, 31 and 32, if I can get there. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Don't be doing that. Don't be speaking evil of anybody. Don't stoop to using lies or anything that might be misleading or falsehoods in your speech about people. Don't speak evil about anybody, and be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. This is very applicable to us. We need to watch what we say and make sure that when we are talking about somebody else, that what we're saying is true. We've got to know that. And if there's any doubt, any question, don't assume a position of righteousness when you might not be right, which then that makes you wrong and therefore gossiping. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 3 verses. Therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking, which again in English we would call gossip. As a newborn babe, desiring the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. Make sure that we don't use this evil speaking. Let's not speak in these terms. Again, what's wrong about gossip is the evil that's involved in it, not if you're just merely talking about a rumor. In 1 Timothy 5:13, Titus 2:13, as well as 1 Timothy 3:11, the young widows, the older widows, or older women and deacons' wives are all warned not to gossip, as we would relate it in our English. And they're from the words tattler and slanderer. Okay, but we would say gossip. But nonetheless, in the Greek, it's more specific. Gossip was forbidden under the old law. I go to Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19, verse 16. Leviticus 19 and verse 16, it says, and you shall not go about as a talebearer, we would call that a gossiper, among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Now notice the gossiper or the tattler here, the talebearer is taking a stand against somebody else. And it's just characterized as gossiping, if you will, or talebearer. Well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about truthfulness, or are we talking about sinfulness? Verse 17 and 18 helps us out. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. Okay, have you noticing? You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So again, you're not going to get upset at somebody who's telling the truth, are you? But you will get upset if somebody's lying about you, or lying to somebody else about you. You see, or misrepresenting you, or implying that you did something wrong when you didn't do anything wrong. The Lord, even under the old law, says don't do that. Actually live by the statement that you love your neighbor as yourself. Recognize that, hey, you know, unless you know for a fact that it's wrong or right, or in other words, unless you know for a fact it's truth, don't assume. Don't go into that avenue by which things are gray, because you could be the one doing the gossiping rather than the person you're accusing of gossip. What did James tell us? James chapter 1, verse 26. In the scripture reading, we used James to describe in chapter 3 how evil the tongue is, how hard it is to control. There are lots of bits of information that really ought not to be spread, and whereas there should be information that should be spread. I'll just illustrate. Wouldn't you like to know if there's a sexual offender in your neighborhood? Well, gossip says don't tell anybody about it, right? Because that's spreading information that he doesn't want. Well, yeah, but what about your kids? You know, wouldn't you like to know if there's a problem in your neighborhood, or that your neighbor has actually got a problem? That, you see, the truth is not gossip, folks. And that's what I'm trying to imply or represent over and over again. James 1 verse 26 tells us, though, if we're involved in gossip, he says, pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this. Oops, I got one verse too right. Verse 26. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Folks, if we can't control our tongue, if we can't control what it is we say, in other words, if we just assume things and run around telling people that things are white when they're actually black, we are the ones doing the gossiping. What is different with our illustrations right off the bat is Paul was telling the truth. And it was black. You see what I'm saying? It was black. And so he said it was black. And there's no doubt that it was black. And so therefore he could talk about it in that sense. When a church withdraws from a member, it isn't like they're just making up something or assuming something. The church has a responsibility to talk to the person involved and to make sure that what they're doing is understood to be wrong, and to encourage them to repent and to get their life right. And then if they fail at all that, then yes, then they tell the whole church. And yes, some of the members of the church might not have heard anything. But yes, it is their business, according to 1 Timothy 5:20. And yes, they should be told, because it's the truth. We've got to watch our tongues. The story is told how gossip can damage someone's reputation. It says the story is told of a very small village in Eastern Europe. One of the men in the community made it his practice to slander the rabbi at every opportunity. At length, feeling guilty of his lies and misrepresentations, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about slander, as he pointed out. The man presented himself to the rabbi, admitted his error, and asked for forgiveness. The rabbi considered for a moment and then told the man to go to the highest hill and there to cut open a feather pillow and scatter the contents to the wind. When you have done that, he said, return to me. The penitent man did as he was told and returned to the rabbi, said, I've done as you asked. Said the slanderer, am I forgiven? Almost, replied the rabbi. He says, you need to just do one more thing. Go and gather all the feathers, gather them all back up. But the man, he protested. He said, but that's impossible. They've been blown to the four winds. And the rabbi says, yes, and so it is also impossible to undo the damage you have done with your words, which can never be retrieved. And that's the thing about gossip. If it's true, it's true. But if it's false, and you spread something that's not correct, guess what? People might not ever hear the correction, even if we're repentant. So what are we saying? In conclusion, the use of lies, misrepresentations, and falsehoods constitutes gossip in our English language. It's more specific in Greek, but to speak of someone's evil conduct is not gossip. Because if they're being evil, that's the truth, right? But telling the truth about someone else's evil conduct is also not gossip. Again, because you're telling the truth. You've got to know it's the truth, though. We should never speak of anyone because it requires a lie, or that requires, if it requires, a lie or a misrepresentation. So one last passage, just one out of Titus, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one. Okay? Speak evil of no one. To be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. Don't speak evil of anyone. You can tell the truth. And if they're being evil, you can tell the truth about their evilness. But don't be speaking evil about anybody, especially if you're assuming it. Especially if you haven't checked it out to make sure that indeed it's not correct. It seems a tall order since we are used to saying what we want. We have a country that we live in that has freedom of speech. And so we, as a people, we take advantage of that. Well, I've got freedom of speech. I can say what I want to do. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you won't get arrested. It's not a crime to say whatever you want to say. But it still could be a sin. And you still could go to hell. So we have to control ourselves. It is even more difficult when others won't treat us with the same courtesy. When we respect the limits that we place upon words, like slandering, we don't go there. Christians should never slander another individual, should never be lying, misrepresenting somebody else or telling falsehood. Should never go there. And if we are, yeah, we're in error, we're wrong, we're gossiping, we're slandering specific. But if somebody is doing something wrong, or has done something wrong, or has done something sinful, that doesn't mean we can't talk about it. Doesn't mean that we can't point it out or try to correct them. Because there's a really simple thing. You see, gossip is an evil form of communication that is never good. And if we are trying to save somebody's soul by pointing out their error, their sin, which is what we're told to do throughout the Bible, to rebuke people of their sin, well, then we're going to have to talk about their evilness. But we need to know that it is their evilness. And that's really where gossip becomes wrong, is when people assume and they didn't do their homework, if you want to call it that, to find out whether or not the person's in the wrong or the right, or whether or not. And that's where you need to go talk to people. That's where you need to find out. You know, is there two sides of the story? Maybe I'm missing something, you know. And after you investigate it and you talk to both sides of the story, you find out, yeah, indeed, they did something wrong. Well, then, yeah, it's not wrong to talk in that sense. So what we really have found out, I hope, and everyone understands very clearly, the word gossip is an English word that takes into account a number of Greek words that we also imply as gossip. Most of them are wrong, are sinful terms, and we should not be using. But we also use the word gossip just to express the idea of a rumor. And that's correct by Webster's definition. That is not wrong. That's not sinful. And so we need to be careful of the distinction and not necessarily always throw in the idea that gossip is always wrong, because it's not always wrong. Probably 9 times out of 10 it is wrong, but gossip's not always wrong. and we have scriptural basis to back that up as we've illustrated. So I hope this actually explains the idea of gossip more fully or better for our usage in our societies by which we live, to understand what it is we're doing and make sure that we're not doing anything that could be misconstrued as being sinful or wrong or evil speaking. If by chance you need our prayer, we'd be glad to pray along with you if you come as we stand and sing the invitation song 343.